Hello and welcome. You'll notice that today's setup is a little bit different than it has been, making some efforts to try and make this look a little bit more professional. So if you'll notice, there's a little bit better lighting. I got a slightly nicer lens for the camera, and I'm also playing with some things to try and improve the audio quality. So hopefully this will make it a much more enjoyable viewing experience for you. Today's episode is a little bit special. It's one that I talked about potentially doing a few weeks ago, but I'm taking one of the talks that I gave for GDEX 2017, and I'm recording my voice over the PowerPoint presentation so that the information can be passed along and expand beyond just the original audience that I shared it with. Now, obviously, it's not as exciting. As I've said before in my videos, when I'm talking to an audience, there's a lot more interactivity, there's a lot more back and forth, and I'm able to adjust my talk a little bit to match what's going on with my audience. Talking to a camera right now, it's really difficult to actually do that, so hopefully it's still good information for you that you'll be able to enjoy. I also wanted to make a comment about last week's video. Last week fell to pieces. And everything I tried recording really did fall apart, and so it ended up being a joke episode. It's like, I just need something that makes me laugh, and so me and my wife sat around playing with it and cutting it together, and because we got a good chuckle out of it, I decided to just make it live. So for those of you who thought it was a serious episode, and there actually were a few people, it was not. Everything in there was made up. It's just for fun, so hopefully you can go back, watch it with that in mind, and just have fun with it. Anyway, I hope you enjoy this week's episode. Hello, and welcome to my talk called Hug a Zombie. Feels appropriate the day before Halloween to be recording this again so that I can share it with all of you, since many of you weren't able to make it to my talk at GDEX 2017. Whenever I start a talk, it always helps for me to explain a little bit about who I am. So I'm Henry Elmo Bawden. I am a husband. I am a father. I'm a teacher. I'm also a game developer. By the way, a shameless self-plug, Electric Flow is out in stores, so please check it out. Also, you can check www.electricflow.com to see progress on the game as we're developing it. Anyway, moving on, I'm also somebody who likes hugs, and I'm someone who asks questions. And this talk is going to be very big on questions. I find that asking questions and looking for good answers is a really good way to help flesh out your designs, your stories, and everything else. So the first question, why do we use zombies? As we're game developers, why do we use zombies so much? Well, I can answer that with another question. First, would you kill this? What about this? All right, so why? What were your gut responses? And please, hopefully, as the audience out there, please tell me you wouldn't kill Piglet. But visually, we see these, even though they're the same character, as two very different individuals. Even though the one on the right may have a fun and flattering personality, may have a great sense of humor, visually, we are scared of it. It's been dehumanized. So let's talk a little bit about what is dehumanization. So dehumanization, just the basic kind of gist of it, is when you remove the humanity from something. So either visually, emotionally, mentally, physically, or in some other way, you make it something that we can no longer relate to. So how would this work? It can be on a larger scale. It can be race versus race. It can be country versus country. So the idea is, for example, World War II, it was Axis versus the Allies. It was our group versus their group. It can even be something like sports teams. Well, it's my team versus your team. It's somehow placing us versus somebody else. And so it's us dehumanizing another large group of individuals. But it can also be small. So it can be little things like school ground fights of, well, that person's stupid, they're evil, they stink, as you can see on the bullet points. But it's somehow diminishing another individual or another human being. So where has this been used? A good place to look at where it's been used is World War II. They, on all sides from all groups, did a mass effort to dehumanize the other sides. They used propaganda like crazy to help rally people on their side against people on the other sides. So yet again, even as I'm talking about it, I'm kind of dehumanizing. I'm breaking everybody into groups. And so that level of dehumanization has been going on for a very long time in various circumstances, and to great effect. But let's ask another question. Why do we do this? So what is the purpose of dehumanization? Well, the big thing is that it absolves us of moral responsibility. When we dehumanize something else, it removes any sense of guilt. It allows us to justify our cruelty and violence. And so what it allows us to do is take away any of the feelings that would hold us back from doing something. For example, with the World War II thing, it takes away that guilt that someone might feel about going out and killing soldiers from another country. It removes that guilt. It's like, no, it's okay. They're not really people. You can go do this. Within Hitler's party, within the Nazis, he was able to say, look, well, the Jews aren't really human, so it's okay to kill them and experiment on them. And so it removed people of moral responsibility, and it allowed them to do horrible things, but in the name of justice or in the name of the greater good or whatever else they wanted to call it. But that was dehumanization. But on a smaller scale, in day-to-day life, we sometimes do the same thing. So let me give you a quick example of that. So asking a kid, well, why did you hurt him? Oh, it's okay because he's ugly and nobody likes him. Well, that's a form of dehumanization. Okay, so why would we do this in games? Well, the majority of games rely on combat. In games, the whole idea is that we want conflict. That's what's enjoyable. That's what makes it fun. If you're just kind of walking through an environment, it can get boring very quickly. Not all games. Some have done a very good job of creating very interesting environments. But most games rely on combat as the way that they're showing conflict and generating action. So once again, back to the question, which can be killed without guilt? What about these two? Which one can be killed without guilt? Or this one, which can be killed without guilt? And if any of you pick the ones on the left, rethink. It's all the ones on the right that can be killed without guilt because they've been dehumanized. So why do we use zombies in games? First, it's fast and easy. We don't have to explain our moral choices and consequences to the player. Gives the player a clear goal and allows for fast action gameplay. You drop a player in an environment and they're surrounded by hungry zombies coming at them. You don't have to give any further explanations like, here's a gun, go! But specifically, this can be used in traditionally safe environments. Whenever you're trying to develop a game in an area where there aren't a lot of enemies, and a lot of games do this where they've got this goal of, well, I want to get the player from point A to point B. I want stuff to happen, but I can't just have them randomly killing civilians along the way. They would, balk at that. They would feel emotionally vested, and that would be a problem. Instead, we need to give them something that they don't feel bad about hurting or killing. Yet again, we want to generate action and combat. And so in even a downtown cityscape or in a house or someplace else, you can generate enemies or things to combat with in a traditionally safe environment. So is using dehumanization always bad? The big, simple answer is no, it's not. In fact, when it's used correctly, I love dehumanization of enemies, where they are very one-sided villains. I love my Disney villains because of how evil they are. Like, there's no ambiguity there. I know exactly who these characters are, and it sets a really good frame of reference for my heroes. And so I like it used in a lot of cases. But then that brings us back to another question. So what is the problem? Well, when we use dehumanization video games, the big issue is just simply, it's lazy. It's enemies for enemies' sake. In general, when people use zombies in games, not all cases, some of the recent zombie games have actually done fairly well in having purpose and meaning with it. But in a lot of cases, when people would use zombies in games, it was just to have something there that they didn't have to put time into. They wouldn't generate backstory. As an audience, we didn't care about them. It was just like, look, there's more fodder. We just have to fight through these. First-person shooters do this a lot too. Why are there thousands and thousands of enemies that we're shooting through? Well, it's to generate action, you know? But if that's the only level we take it to, then that isn't always enough. We don't become attached. We don't really care about what's going on. So this is a problem simply because it can be used as a lazy escape. So this is used with zombies, Nazis, monsters, and anything else that's used indiscriminately is where it becomes a problem. So let's ask another question. Are there ways to make dehumanization more meaningful? Well, let's start by asking some questions about it. For example, why is this enemy here? What purpose does it serve? Why am I justified in hurting it? What threat does it pose? Do I connect with it? And the big one that should always be remembered when you're generating story or when you're working on video games in any form or fashion, why should I care? Well, a couple of things we can do with it after asking a question is a good trick is to just use humor and have fun with it. For example, this one right here is Zombies Ate My Neighbors. In this case, zombies were used as mindless fodder. But the idea was that they were doing it very tongue-in-cheek. Everything about this game had humor in it. It was like riffing off all of the horrible B-movies that had come out. And so everything, even the level titles and the enemies and the characters, were about kind of mocking that low-end horror genre of movies. And it was fun. It was funny. And so even the main character, he's got those 3D movie theater glasses he's wearing. I mean, it's very, very in-your-face, tongue-in-cheek humor, and they did a great job with it. And so using dehumanization in this case worked. Another way is to create things that actually fit into a biome and add to an experience. So not necessarily zombies, but things like creatures can be used in ways that help add to the immersive environment. Now, I may not get to know like all of these scorpions on a first-name basis. I may not need to know their individual motivations, but what they do is they become part of the terrain. They become part of the environment with their biome. And so I begin to care about them, not as necessarily individual creatures, but more in the context of how is this showing me that this world is alive? And so using these dehumanized creatures, but in a way that still adds to this experience. Also, you can use dehumanization as a way to create instances of imperfect information. So this is another example from Final Fantasy, but even in the case of like real life military, let's look back at the World War II example. Sending somebody as a soldier into combat with this idea that all of my enemies are monsters. These are horrible creatures that have to be fought. Well, you're sending someone in with imperfect information. That dehumanization is being used to motivate them to go in and just slaughter another group for no other reason than, hey, as the crew member says, that's our duty. We have to do it. But it also creates the opportunity for more meaningful story. For example, in the case of a soldier going in World War II, fighting these other units, and then somehow ending up in a circumstance where they have to be in close contact with the people that they saw as monsters, as inhuman, and get to know them, understand why those people are in the situation they're in. And you see that that suddenly becomes an opportunity to use dehumanization as a gating device for leading us into learning about other people and then still having to make choices based on the new information that's coming in. Okay, so the idea is that you explore the meaning behind it and the reasons for our response. So asking another question, is it okay to hurt this even if it is a threat to me? Even if I have dehumanized it, even if there's nothing I can really relate to, is it still okay to hurt this thing? So those were some ways you can make dehumanization more meaningful, but let's ask another question. What alternatives are there to dehumanization? Well, one is simply removing consequences. So let me give a couple examples of that. First way of doing this is to stylize. So you can see that bottom left example is Cloudy with a Chance of Meatballs. When Sony Animation was working on this, as the story goes, when they first were starting this, they were trying to match what a lot of the other 3D studios were doing, where they were trying to make everything really realistic. Like Pixar was pushing the edge of realism in their animations. And so they started doing that, but very quickly they realized that when you have realistic looking people and realistic cars and houses being crushed by giant food falling out of the sky, that's not funny. That's sad. It's scary. And when you have this realistic food sitting everywhere, the thought of it actually becomes very disgusting. It's going to rot. It's going to mold. It's making a mess of the town. And so any humor within the cartoon gets lost very quickly. And so the way they solved that was by stylizing, or like stepping away from the visual reality and into more of that cartoony exaggeration, to be able to find a balance where this could be humorous, it could be fun and playful, and not get to the horrifying and gross. Another way of removing the consequences is by making sure that there's no death or damage. The Rune Factory series did this by saying, well, as you're fighting monsters with your tools and your weapons, they're actually coated with this special material. And so you're not hurting the animals that you're fighting, because many of them we needed to be able to connect with. When we fought them, we would actually tame them and turn them into our pets. And so you don't want to hurt something, like be killing off these things and then pick one and have it as your friend. You needed to have that safety net. And so the idea was the tools and weapons are coated with this material, so when you attack a monster or a creature, you're not hurting it, you're helping it. They come from a different plane, like a different planet or zone of existence or whatever else you want to call it, but they live in a different place. And this simply helps return them back home. So you're doing them a favor. So there's no death or damage in combat. You're capturing them to turn them into friends, or you're sending them home. You're actually a good person by fighting these monsters and creatures. The third example is Pokemon. So creating safety within battle. So in Pokemon, nothing ever dies. Things get weakened, but if they ever get severely hurt, you protect them, you take them to a health center, and you make sure that they're taken care of. Because the idea is that these are your friends, these are your pals. Even the wild Pokemon, you're not trying to kill, you're trying to have battles with, to gain experience, to weaken, to catch, and stuff like that. All right, another thing that ties into removing consequences and with creating safety within battle is sport. So a lot of games that have multiplayer online components, it's not about what's actually happening to the characters. You don't become, frightened or concerned that you're hurting another individual or another living human being. All you're doing is you're playing a game. It is sport. So the example there is Halo. So in Halo, when you defeat other players in multiplayer, you're not really worried about them. You're not worried about your friend on the other side of his headset. You're like, haha, I got you. And then he can come back because he respawns, and then suddenly the game's afoot again. And so it becomes fun and it's playful. And so there's no real consequences of having the other players humanized. You know the other players, you know the other characters, you know the creatures, and that's okay, because there's no serious long-lasting consequences. This becomes playful and immersive without it becoming something that is like, wow, I'm really doing damage. I'm a horrible individual. And so you remove those consequences. Another alternative to dehumanization is actually developing characters. Rather than going the cheap zombie route and removing characters and just saying, look, here's fodder, kill it. We actually want to develop characters. So these are two examples of other characters that we get to know in depth. By having characters that we know more in depth, then when we do have conflict, when we do have turmoil with these characters, we can relate to them, we can understand them, and actually make it a much more immersive and engaging experience. Another option is developing stronger rationale and justification, as with the example of when there was dehumanization and that imperfect information going into the situation for a soldier in World War II. Well, once you finally do get to know who the enemy actually is, you start to understand, okay, well, what are their motivations? What would be the justifications for, ending another human being's life? Well, in wartime, for self-preservation, defending others, as it's written there on the slide. But really, what are the deeper emotional struggles that I'm having as an individual trying to make this decision if I know who this other group is? So this allows us an opportunity to actually focus in. And once again, the idea is not to take away story, take away narrative, take away things and go, cheap and just say, wow, it's just bad, just kill it. If we're going to have combat, a way of actually using that is to humanize things and give us rationale and reasons. And so suddenly we become much more emotionally vested in this process. It's no longer, well, I just have 1,000 things to fight through for the sake of fighting through them and to reach an end goal. It's, wow, each of these battles becomes very emotionally impactful, emotionally powerful, and we can use that to actually help enhance and build the engagement in the experience. Okay, the next one is to explore the meaning behind and the reasons for our responses. So once again, humanize the enemies. If we're going to do stuff, if we're going to take actions, it helps to understand why, and it allows the player to become more vested in the product. All right, in addition to all the ones, those were all kind of combat examples, but in addition to the combat, you can also develop alternative forms of conflict in games that are in addition to combat. In fact, some of the games I like the best have no combat whatsoever. There's still conflict there. There's emotional conflict. There's a lot of other types of conflict. I've got the example there of Harvest Moon. I love the Harvest Moon series, but it's the conflict is me against the environment. Like, how well can I try and develop my farms? How successful can I be? And there's conflict within that, but it doesn't have to be combat. I'm not going out and, knocking out monsters with my hoe and my shovel. You can do that in Rune Factory, yet again, which is kind of a variant on Harvest Moon. But Harvest Moon itself, there is no combat. But there's emotional conflict, there's environmental conflict, physical conflict, cultural conflict, mental skill, time challenges. So puzzle games are very engaging, clue games, mystery games. Those can all be alternatives to combat within games. And so yet again, in those cases, there's no reason for dehumanization. In fact, the more we humanize everything in those types of games, the more engaged we can become with them. So what's the main takeaway from all this? Well, the easy answer is don't be lazy. And in that list of things like zombies, I also include time travel or amnesia, because some of the worst stories I have run into involve those three things where they're used in a lazy way. You'll see this a lot in television series where you get close to the end of a season. It's like, we don't know what to do. Okay, we're going back in time and just change things. And so next season where we're losing 2 or 3 actors or actresses, we can just make it fresh again, as if nothing ever happened. And we can relive it. But it's lazy writing. It's people have written themselves into a corner and they don't know what to do, so they're taking the lazy way out. Zombies, time travel, amnesia. Great, we got a way out. And so don't do that. If you are going to use zombies, then make sure that there's meaning behind it. Make sure it's a conscientious choice about why you're going to use them. If you're going to be using something else, then great. Make sure that it supports the experience you're trying to achieve. Now, do I think all games have to go into as much depth as I was giving with like the alternative forms of dehumanization? Well, no, not really. Sometimes I like my straightforward games. Like I said, my dehumanized villains where I'm a hero, I need to go rescue somebody, and I need to do good and help the kingdom out. I love my Mario Brothers games. And I like that, just the good versus bad sometimes. But at the same time, I don't want all my games to be that way. I like even the other variants of Mario Brothers. I loved it in the first Super Mario RPG when I finally got to play as Bowser, and he became a meaningful character that was part of the team. And so in those ways, it's good to have different attempts, but just don't be lazy. Be aware of the decisions that you're making. Make sure that all of your decisions support that core experience that you're trying to achieve. So once again, look at ways that you can use dehumanization effectively and meaningfully, but also look for the alternatives to dehumanization at additional ways to deepen and enhance your experiences. Because this is not actually live at this point, I'm just recording this in my basement so that, once again, those who couldn't be at GDEX 2017 and listen to the talk can hear it here and use the information. If you do have questions, please post them below here on the YouTube channel. So anyways, thank you. Appreciate you listening.